we are eating too many calories and we're not eating enough nutrients at the same time. All of those deficiencies can add up. Most people probably have multiple deficiencies. You could feel tired or lethargic, but you could just think, I'm just not sleeping well, or life is busy and stressful. But they all contribute to health and well-being. And another fascinating point, GLP-1s, so you really have to be mindful that you're getting more nutrient density per bite than you were previously.
Your rating system, which, like I said, is different and very groundbreaking, pioneering.
So it kind of influences consumers and industry in the right direction. And then it can be used for policy.
What is the food that most Americans are consuming and think is healthy that actually scored relatively low on your rating system?
And this is where it gets really controversial.
Can processed meats actually be relatively healthy foods? Give us, you scored 289 foods. So what groups are the highest in nutrient density that you think people should focus on?
Yeah, so if you want to get the most nutrients per bite.
Hey everyone, most Americans are eating more calories than ever and simultaneously deficient in several nutrients that their body actually needs. And unaware of this whole process that's occurring because the signs and symptoms of nutrient deficiency can be really silent and they can be subtle, though they can significantly impact the quality of your life and potentially your lifespan. And we've also been misled about which foods best fill those gaps, which is why today we have Dr. Beal on the show. He's a returning guest. He's one of my favorite researchers out there. He's the head of food systems and data and analytics. He actually created a new groundbreaking rating system called the Nutritional Value Score. And he was also a member of the 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans Scientific Review Group. So welcome to the show, Dr. Beal. I'm really excited to be talking to you.
Thanks so much for having me, Autumn. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and I do honestly think shifting the focus from calories to nutrients is one of the most important and impactful things, dietary changes people could focus on. So before we get into that and your rating system, we're going to just do a few rapid fire questions to help people get a taste of what's to come. So what is the food that most Americans are consuming and think is healthy that actually scored relatively low on your rating system?
So whole grains do not score particularly high. They're not towards the bottom, but they're kind of below halfway point, which, just kind of shows they're not the most nutritious foods. They're part of healthy diets for many, but they're not essential by any means.
Okay. Now, what is the myth about nutrient density or maybe misconception that irritates you most?
I think that people think of sort of the US as not having any problems with nutrients because we're a developed country with tons of money. And so we have just a problem of excess calories. But when you look at the data, that's not really true. We have many deficiencies. We have inadequacies in calcium, iron, potassium, many others. And so I think that's one thing I would really like to raise awareness of, is that we are eating too many calories and we're not eating enough nutrients at the same time.
Perfect. So what are the 2 or 3 foods that are relatively high scoring on your nutrient rating system that you think would surprise people?
So I think the leafy greens is probably not surprising to many people because people think salad is healthy. But I think maybe organ meats, not everyone's thinking about organ meats these days.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit more with some of the attention from the dietary guidelines where they're in there. So, things like liver, kidney, spleen, these types of meats are not very commonly consumed, right? If you didn't grow up eating liver and onions, they're probably not your favorite thing, or you may have never even tried these foods, right? But they're very high in nutrients. And what's different about many of the other foods like dark leafy greens is that they contain much more bioavailable forms. So your body's going to absorb very high levels of those nutrients.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that makes your research so different, is that you accounted for this bioavailability, and we'll get into that in a second. Okay, true or false? There was a system used to guide health policy that actually gave Frosted Flakes and mini wheats a higher score that made it look healthier than a boiled egg.
Yes, there was a system called Food Compass, and it came out a few years ago, and it rated foods in a similar fashion, but you saw things like Frosted Mini Wheats, you saw Lucky Charms, Honey Nut Cheerios scoring higher than whole foods like a boiled egg, ground beef, or cheddar cheese.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that put you on my radar, so I'm excited. We will talk about that a little more. And last one is, can processed meats actually be relatively healthy foods?
Yeah, so there's a range of processing. So there is ultra processed, and there are other foods that are moderately processed or lightly processed. And you can see that in the health impacts. There's not a lot of data, but there is data on the nutrient density and the nutritional value. And what we found is that moderately processed, just dried meats, for example, where you just add salt or maybe some spices and it's sort of a lean meat, can actually contain quite a bit of nutritional value and bioavailable nutrients as well. So it's definitely nutritious, but there's also the concern of excess processing and too much, the additives like the nitrates and the nitrites and too much sodium, depending on your diet and how much potassium you eat and whether you're low carb or high carb or whatnot. So there
Yeah.
are concerns, but it's not all bad.
I love that. Because, yeah, there's sugar, there's gluten, there's MSG. There's just, I mean, like the category of, processed meat is just really, really wide. And there's a lot of factors at play. Okay. So we've heard, like I've talked about, of a lot about overconsumption in America, eating too many calories. So, what is the other side? Why do you think paying attention to nutrients is as important? And just discuss how prevalent nutrient deficiency actually is. Expand on
Yeah.
that.
So just to sort of validate that we eat too many calories, we have, 3/4 of the adult population are overweight or obese. So we do consume too many calories. What many people don't necessarily realize is that nutrient-dense foods are typically more satiating. So they actually can help with both sides of the spectrum, not just the, undernutrition side of things, but also with moderating how much you consume. So if you eat whole foods like a boiled egg, even like a lean steak, a salad, right, fruits and vegetables, all of that, all of those foods are not really contributing to us overeating. It's the highly refined, hyper palatable foods that we eat too much of. But in terms of nutrient inadequacy or deficiencies, one surprising stat that people don't realize that women of reproductive age, so 15 to 49 years, 1/3 of women are iron deficient. And that is in a country where we have access to all the foods we want, we think, right? We have access to supplements if we need them, yet we still have 1/3 of the population.
Crazy.
So iron is one. There's a lot of data on calcium, potassium, magnesium, choline, vitamin D. All of those are lacking to some degree. And really among people, most people probably have multiple deficiencies. And it's not really easy to understand how they're affecting their health because they can have subtle consequences that you're not really aware of. You could feel tired or lethargic, but you could just think, I'm just not sleeping well, or life is busy and stressful. But they all contribute to health and well-being. And so all of those deficiencies can add up. And there's some really fascinating research that shows that actually the people who are suffering from chronic diseases and obesity can have a harder time absorbing nutrients as well. So there's this ironic condition where you can actually be overeating calories and not getting enough, your body's not absorbing enough. And another fascinating point, GLP-1s are expanding rapidly. They're becoming more affordable. More people are taking these drugs, and that is reducing the amount of calories, which is a positive thing for a lot of people, reducing the amount of calories people eat. But what that also means is they're getting less nutrients in general. They're getting fewer nutrients overall if you're eating less food. So you really have to be mindful that you're getting more nutrient density per bite than you were previously.
Yes, that's a point that I've been hearing a lot of buzz about in the functional nutrition and functional food space. That every calorie is basically going to have to fight for its worth eventually as more and more people adopt these drugs. So that's a very important point. So, and like you said, it's possible to eat a 2,000 plus calorie diet every day and still be nutrient deficient. So can you tell us like that long term, so fatigue, maybe mental health issues, what are the long term consequences? Are there nutrient deficiencies actually related to disease in the research?
Yeah, so I am not an expert on the chronic disease influence of micronutrient deficiencies, but there are some studies out there. I know one for zinc. Researchers looked at the proportional contribution of zinc deficiency to chronic disease burden, and it was not negligible. It was like 7 or 8%, if I remember correctly. And so when you think about I don't know all the evidence, but when you actually break down the contribution of nutrient deficiencies to chronic diseases, there is a role. And they add up because we're deficient in a lot of nutrients. And if you think about quality of life, if you're vitamin D deficient, which many people are, and you're iron deficient and you have either borderline anemia or you have anemia and you're not feeling well, you're not being able to be productive, maybe you're not exercising as much. With calcium, you don't have strong bones, right? It's not just calcium, it's other factors. But if you don't have enough calcium, you don't have strong bones. One of the number one, risk factors in older adulthood is not a chronic disease necessarily. It's sort of the fractures or, weak bones, which osteoporosis could count as that. But it's sort of, we have, I think the stat is really high. It's like 1 in 2 women will have a broken bone at some point in their life. And so it's just really, really, really important to have higher nutrient density. And when you get into the older adult range, so at like age 65, it becomes more important, partly because, lean muscle mass is declining. You have to work harder to keep whatever muscle you do have. And so preventing falls, part of that is just the strength itself. And then the diet quality and the nutrient density plays into that with the bone health. And so you're not eating as many calories because you have lower energy needs in that period, and you need higher protein. And so all of those things add up to where maybe it's not contributing necessarily to cancer, maybe it's not contributing to cardiovascular disease directly, but there are these other components that are reducing the quality of life, potentially making it so that people don't feel as active, they don't get as good enough of sleep, they're not necessarily socializing. So I think there's a lot of downstream effects. Now, I won't argue to know what proportion of chronic diseases are from micronutrient deficiencies. I don't know. I'm not sure anybody knows, but there is a meaningful amount. So it's worth paying attention to.
Absolutely. And it's one of those factors that we have control over. Whereas, like, environmental toxicity to a larger extent, sometimes, you know what I mean, less under our thumb, so to speak. And there's Dr. Bruce Ames' triage theory of micronutrient deficiency too. And I'm sure you're familiar, where the body is going to allocate its resources to your short-term survival, but then processes that would guarantee a longer and longer life, higher quality of life, those might be neglected according to this theory. So that's interesting to consider as well. So it's foundational, as we were talking about. But now before we go to your rating system, which, like I said, is different and very it kind of groundbreaking, pioneering. Let's talk about the other rating systems, because this is where you got on a lot of people's radar, is where you saw the Tufts University Food Compass rating system, and that we spoke about earlier. So can you just give us an overview? What are the current rating systems that you felt you could improve upon? What was wrong with the methodology? You actually wrote a critique about this, so just tell us about that.
Yeah, so just stepping back, when you think about a food rating system, most of these systems that are out there are using very limited data. So when you look at a nutrition facts panel, you see your calories, you see protein, fiber, sodium, saturated fat, maybe added sugar. There's not much more. You're not seeing a lot of information about the, nutrient density of a food. So what the systems that are out there have done that are used on a front of pack label, for example, in Europe or Australia and New Zealand, there's a system called Nutri-Score. That's the most widely used in Europe. And then there's Health Star Rating, which is used in Australia and New Zealand. Now, those are the two biggest ones because they've gone through some processes. They've been sort of adopted by many governments to actually inform consumer decision-making on the package. So they rate, is the food green or red? Is it 5 stars or 3 stars or 1 star, etc. Now, what came out with Tufts and this Food Compass score is that they actually went a lot deeper, which I was excited about. Instead of just looking at the nutrition facts panel, they looked at the micronutrients, they looked at nutrient ratios, they looked at factors that are more sophisticated. And so I was expecting a really good system. And I think they improved upon Nutri-Score for sure and Health Star Rating. But what we ended up seeing is that there's some weird anomalies from this system. A lot of the sugary breakfast cereals, even things like egg substitutes, a lot of these sort of like juices, chocolate covered almonds, we're just scoring really high compared to some other minimally processed whole foods. And so some colleagues of mine looked at this and we wrote a critique of this. And what ended up happening is that a couple of years later, Food Compass came out with a version 2. And version 2 addressed a lot of the critiques that we made. And so I think, version 2 is much better. But, when we set out to do this, we were thinking, let's do something that uses the data we have available, that's sensible. And we addressed a lot of sort of shortcomings of the systems. Most of them just did nutrient density per calorie. They didn't quantify the bioavailability. They included nutrients that were not a major public health concern, like cholesterol or phosphorus. And the way that things were crafted, it didn't result in an output that really made sense to me and to my colleagues. So we set out, we're going to do a new system here, and that's why we did it. We weren't thinking we love food rating systems and we just want to build something from the ground up. We thought people are using these systems already, and there's only so much you can do with a system, but if they're going to be used, let's make one that is as good as it can be.
Absolutely. And can you, before we go into your criteria, why are these systems important? Like, what are they informing? What are the results of these rating systems?
Yeah, so there's a few different things. So the first one is like a label. If you have a product that's packaged and there's a label on it, one, it influences the consumer. So there's some evidence to say consumers may choose to purchase foods if they're rated better, if they understand the system. But what it does in a larger part is that it kind of puts a pressure on industry and the food companies to, if they're going to produce foods, they want their food scoring higher because they don't want sort of the negative appeal marketing aversion. People say, this is not going to be healthy. I don't necessarily want it. So it kind of influences consumers and industry in the right direction. And then it can be used for policy. So things can be subsidized based on this. You can use it to potentially screen foods or filter foods for SNAP benefits for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. You could use it in school meals to sort of identify which foods to prioritize or which foods to limit. And there's different policy levers that you can use. But what often is used in a global context is that you want to invest in helping people get access to nutritious foods, and you can't change the whole diet, and so you focus on one food or a food group in a particular program or project. And so this guides us to say, what are the most nutrient-dense foods that are going to have the biggest impact? And then you can sort of choose those and have a better impact than if you're just choosing a food without that information. You're not going to, if you were just to choose a fruit, for example, if you choose a watermelon versus a guava or something that's more nutrient dense, it's going to have a different impact.
I love that. And yeah, right now we have this surplus of grains, these foods, and it makes sense, right? Because they're easy to store, easy to grow, but not necessarily the kind of nutrient dense food that we need to thrive, especially as we're eating fewer calories. And so I'm excited to see what can happen if people start to take notice. So walk us through the 7 components of your nutritional value score, and what are you measuring and why are you measuring those things?
Sure. So we looked at nutrient density in terms of essential nutrients, but we didn't want to include nutrients that either are not a public health concern or are widely available and consumed. So, for example, omega-6 fatty acid, it's an essential fat. So you could argue we need to have this in the system, but our thinking was almost everybody gets plenty omega-6 and potentially too much omega-6 and not enough omega-3. So when we looked at things like that from that perspective, so in terms of vitamins, we have 11 vitamins that are a public health concern. We have data showing that they're lacking in diets. We did the same for minerals. We have 5 minerals. For protein, we wanted to get at the quantity and the quality. So we adjusted for sort of the bioavailability using the DIAs. And then we have a picture of just omega-3 in terms of long chain and short chain omega-3s, but not even including omega-6 because we have too much. Then we looked, yeah, go ahead.
And you included DPA, which I thought was so cool. Yes, because there's like ALA, which is the plant form, EPA, DPA, which has traditionally kind of been thrown by the wayside, but you got it in there. I was really excited about that. Continue.
That was cool. It's funny because most people are not, when they see DPA, they're like, what is DPA? I've heard of EPA and DHA, but what is DPA? But it's a long chain omega-3 fat.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we have other components now that we wanted to get at the chronic disease risk. And this is where it gets really controversial. So we included fiber. Fiber in general, satiating, we don't consume what sort of the guidelines recommend in the US and other countries. We also included calorie density because calories with really high calorie dense foods that can lead to overconsumption. We did put a cutoff so that we only penalized foods that were very calorie dense as opposed to just sort of whole foods like eggs were not really penalized. When we looked at the other last component was nutrient ratios. Now this gets at the quality of different types of components within foods that reflect chronic disease risk. So the first one is carb to fiber. So you're looking at how much carbohydrate is there versus how much fiber is in there, and you obviously want more fiber and lower carbs,
What does that
lower
do?
glycemic. Lower glycemic index, right? It's the quality of the carb, so it's telling you how refined is that. So if you have a whole grain, or if you have a whole potato, or if you have something that's extracted into a starch or a refined flour, you lose a lot of the carbohydrate and you have more of the carb. The sodium to potassium ratio is another kind of way to distinguish the processing of foods. So most foods have a fair amount of potassium. If you think of plant foods, if it's a grain or a potato, if it's a fruit or a vegetable, it has quite a bit of potassium. Now, if you refine that food and process it and extract the starch from that food, you're left without much potassium. And oftentimes in the processing, you'll add a bunch of sodium. So that ratio will tell you, if you look at the packaged food, if you have a lot more sodium than potassium, that tells you there's not a lot of the whole food in there, and they've added a bunch of sodium on top of it. And so if you have a natural food like beans without any sodium added, you have very high potassium per serving, very low sodium. But if you have a, refined cracker or cookie or something, you're going to have almost no potassium and lots of sodium
Yeah.
potentially.
And could potentially imbalance in that ratio increase the risk for high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. Is there anything else you want to say about that ratio as it pertains to the impacts on health?
Yeah, I think we hear sodium, and the general guidance is limit sodium to a certain amount, right? I think it's 2,300 milligrams per day on a 2,000 calorie diet. But what that sort of fails to account for is that the real risk of sodium for the large part is the imbalance with potassium. When you don't get enough fruits and vegetables and other potassium-rich foods, and you're having a lot of sodium, that's where you have the higher blood pressure and the higher risks for cardiovascular disease. So this sort of builds both of those components into the score, and it tells you the quality of the food. Now, the last component is the saturated fat to unsaturated fat ratio, which we didn't include originally because it, from my perspective, there's a lot of whole food sources that contain saturated fat that are healthy, and I wasn't really interested in penalizing them too much. But we got reviewer feedback, and I think in general, there's some risk for some proportion of the population, right, where a lot of saturated fat can raise cholesterol or ApoB in particular. And so what we did is we included this ratio as one of the components. So the higher the saturated fat to unsaturated fat ratio, that's going to be penalized. So the unsaturated fats like nuts and seeds and avocados generally are scoring higher than the saturated fat.
Interesting. Okay, I knew that, but that is fascinating. I'm sure you've received some feedback on that from various communities. We'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
The other thing I loved about your rating system was that you somewhat penalized ultra-processed foods, right? Can you go into how you accounted for that and why you think that's important?
That's right. So that's, the saturated fat and then the ultra processing are some of the most controversial parts of this. Ultra processing is not flawless. Not all ultra processed foods have the same risk, but we felt it was important that in general, all of the evidence sort of combines to say that diets high in ultra processed foods increase risk for numerous chronic diseases. And so we wanted to penalize it in a way that took away from the food, but it didn't say you can't have any moderately nutritious foods with ultra processing. So we ended up doing a separate penalty after the main algorithm was applied with those 7 components. And we did a 25% penalty. And so for context, Food Compass did, I think, a 5% penalty for the first version. They may have increased it in the second version. I don't remember. They may have gone up to 10%, but 5 to 10% penalty. So we increased that quite a bit from there. But then this is where you hear from both sides, where the really big activists who say, we think that all ultra processed foods should be limited. They're destroying all of our health. We shouldn't even promote anything with ultra processing. They would say it should be just like a yes, no. If it's ultra processed, don't consume it. So those folks aren't really happy. But then the folks who say, look, ultra processing is like an important part of making foods tasty and affordable and long shelf life, and there's plenty of healthy ultra processed foods, you shouldn't be penalizing it. So we did somewhere, I think, where that's sort of in between of those two camps, and hopefully that kind of comes through when you look at the scores in a sensible way of saying these fall where they should fall, or roughly where they should fall. Not that every food is scored perfect.
Yes, but I can always count on you for balance, right? You're always kind of in the middle. You're hearing both sides, you're taking it in, and you're adjusting accordingly. That's why I love your system. So let's touch on before we go to what the data found bioavailability. It's what sets a lot of your scoring systems and findings apart in a large sense. So what does that look like to account for, and why is this important?
Yeah. So bioavailability is tricky because it depends on so many factors. Depends on the individual's status. So when you're low in iron, your body upregulates your absorption, so you absorb more.
Mhm.
It depends on the diet. When you consume, non-heme iron, for example, which is in plant source foods, with animal source foods, it increases absorption. If
Mm.
you consume them with vitamin C, it increases absorption. So all of these things are very complicating, and you can't do a perfect adjustment because you don't know if you're rating one food, you don't know the context that it's consumed. But to me, it felt like a much bigger mistake to not account for any bioavailability because we know it matters. So I tried to get at somewhere around the average, wherever that would be, just assuming that some people are going to be consuming, more of animal source foods or vitamin C, for example, if it's a case of iron, phytate in the case of zinc. So I'll just talk about what we did. So for protein, I mentioned we used the DS. So that's a way of adjusting for not just the quantity, but the quality as well. It looks at, the indispensable amino acids, which are these essential amino acids that we can't, produce. And it kind of standardizes it. So it tells you whatever the limiting amino acid is, it's going to drop the score to whatever degree that amino acid is limiting. And so the higher the score, the more complete these amino acid profiles are. That sort of adjusts for the protein, so it's not just about the quantity, it's the quality. We also looked at some micronutrients, and the trick here is that when you have a requirement called nutrient reference intake, or if you've probably heard of the RDA, what is the recommended dietary allowance? It is really saying what is a target for an individual, and in the metric itself, for some nutrients, it adjusts for bioavailability. So people may not know this, but a retinol activity equivalent, an RAE, for vitamin A says if you consume vitamin A from dairy, from fish, from animal sources, from liver, that is basically in a form that your body can absorb, right? It's in retinol. You don't have to convert it from a carotenoid. So when you have it in a carrot, an orange sweet potato, red pepper, etc., you have to convert these carotenoids, and beta carotene is the most common one, but there's others. So you have to convert those into retinol. And that typically happens at a ratio of about 12 to 1. So you need 12 times as much from the plant source as you need from the animal source to have an equivalent amount. Now, even this is really tricky because one study found that raw carrots converted about 77 to 1 to retinol, whereas beta carotene in oil was 2 to 1. So it just shows you the range. It's a huge range, but there was a system that created this, and they said, okay, we're going to call this an RAE. Folate has this, it's dietary folate equivalent, but many nutrients don't. So iron and zinc are two really prominent nutrients that we have challenges with, especially iron in the US, where if you look at a can of beans and you look at a steak, and they tell you this is 20% of your daily value of iron, it assumes they're the same bioavailability. And we know that that's not true. And so what we wanted to do is say, okay, if there's heme iron in a food, if there's not a lot of phytate, right, we are going to account for that and basically assume a higher absorption from those foods. So we have sort of a tiered system where ruminant meat, which is about 2/3 to 3/4 heme iron, gets the highest bioavailability, and then sort of poultry and eggs and others get sort of a lower tier, and then the lowest bioavailable foods are these foods where it's like legumes, which are beans, peas, lentils, and whole grains like corn or wheat, and they contain plenty of iron but lots of phytate as well, and it's bound together, and your body doesn't absorb it as much as the human.
Yes, that was one of the things I thought would surprise people, was specifically the legumes and the fact that phytates can interfere there. And like you said, so many factors. And then also, even plants or animals aren't all going to contain the animal form of that nutrient. You know what I mean? Like it's not all going to be heme iron or it's not all going to be retinol. There's going to be a mix. So I love you for attacking the complexity because you're right. I mean, there's going to never be a perfect system, but I think you've gotten as close as is possible at this point. And my last question before the results is, how does this, the other paper that you wrote that I was a big fan of is priority micronutrient density. So we've talked about that rating system. Are there any important differences other than, the criteria you've chosen for the algorithm? It's what are the differences between those two systems in case anyone wants to know?
Yeah, so that this system, the nutritional value score, really built on that system. So initially, when we developed the priority micronutrient density score, we were looking at 6 micronutrients. It was iron, zinc, calcium, folate, vitamin B12, and vitamin A. And the reason we looked at those is because the work we were doing with UNICEF at the time was in young children's diets and mothers in low-income contexts in Africa and in Asia, where there were these high prevalence of micronutrient deficiencies, and they were causing a lot of health issues and growth and development faltering. So we prioritized that in the score. We looked at what the nutrient gaps were. We created a scoring system to rate foods for that purpose. And then when we got new funding to do more work on trying to holistically assess how do we prioritize foods for health and for sustainability, I wanted to make a system that was much more comprehensive because we know food is not just about micronutrients, it's so much more, and it's not just about vitamins and minerals. So we expanded the micronutrients. So we have 11 vitamins and 5 minerals, so that's 16 altogether as opposed to 6. We added protein, we added omega-3, we added fiber, we added calorie density, and we added all those nutrient ratios I talked about because we wanted to have a more holistic picture. And so that's where it came from. It really builds on that work and tries to add more information about food quality and nutritional value than just the 6 micronutrients alone.
Yeah, and I see a lot of parallels. A lot of the foods are similar, like at least in the top tier. So let's talk about it. Give us, you scored 289 foods. So what groups are the highest in nutrient density that you think people should focus on first?
Yeah, so if you want to get the most nutrients per bite, dark leafy greens are really good. So these are kale, chard, spinach, romaine lettuce, lots of different leaves, right? The second, which is basically to say there's much overlap here, is organ meats. So these are the things we talked about before. You have liver, you have spleen, kidney, heart. Those 2 groups are the sort of towards the very, very top. They are full of vitamins and minerals. Often either the vegetables, the dark leafy greens have a lot of fiber as well, right? Low in calories. The organ meats are very bioavailable. They're also high in protein. The third most, highest scoring food group was fish and seafood. And that's probably not surprising to people, but, fatty fish, salmon, mackerel, sardines, those scored really well because they contain a lot of omega-3. And if you eat the fish with the skin, you get more nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin D. If you eat the fish with the bones, you get calcium and other nutrients. So if you have these sort of canned sardines, for example, canned salmon, you're getting a lot of nutrient density in there, and you're getting the protection from the omega-3 as well. So those are like the top 3 food groups that we found.
And I know there's like intra-group variation as well. So, okay, so give us like the greens. Like, are those 3 or 4 that you named, are they the most nutrient dense in the greens category?
Yeah, there's less variability in the dark leafy greens because one thing about dark leafy greens and herbs, so if you think about cilantro, parsley, mint, basil, these foods have not been changed very much from their crop wild relatives or their ancestors, their wild relatives. They haven't changed very much because they're sort of their culinary purpose is to have these kind of rich flavors, strong flavors. And so other foods like grains, like corn is a grass, but we bred it into this very starch heavy, low in protein, lower in nutrients, grows faster. Fruit, we've grown them to be bigger and bigger. So the reason that there's not as much variability in those dark leafy greens is because they're all pretty close to the sort of wild relative. Many of these are sort of wild growing foods anyways that grow, in nature.
Well, I love that. And are you, Beal, eating organ meats? Because I know they are very nutrient dense, but Are you consuming them? Is a certain kind higher in nutrient density? What are your thoughts on how people can get more organ meats?
Yeah. For me, I don't love the taste of organ meats, but I can tolerate them, and I think they taste pretty good if they're sort of cut with regular meat.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when you have some of these ground, like the ground beef, ground bison, ground venison, where you add like maybe it's 25, 30, 50% of
10.
organ meats, sometimes liver or 10, yeah, liver, right? I think if you look at the density of organs, liver is one of the top ones. It's also really high in vitamin A, so you don't want to consume it too frequently. If you're pregnant, you need to sort of limit how much you consume it, maybe once a month or twice a month. But yeah, liver is very, very dense. Kidney is one that's very nutrient dense as well. But in terms of palatable, I think heart is a more palatable, or tongue if you have that sort of more palatable version of these. But to me, the products that I like are the ground meats with the organs added in, the liverwurst. So there's like a fresh liverwurst that has kidney, heart, and liver. And it's done in a way, it's not super processed, and it's done in a way I think it's pretty palatable. And then if you have, if you cook a whole chicken, what we do is, we put the liver and the heart inside of the chicken and we roast it. And then you have it's not a lot, but a little bit of liver goes a long way. So if everyone in the family just has a little bit of liver, if they can tolerate it, that's an easy way to get some nutrients.
I love that so much. And yeah, we do have a primal blend at Wild Pastures, and I think it's like 10 or 15%. And then you can supplement too, though. I know Lucas Krasinski. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's a researcher. Are you familiar with his work?
Vaguely, yeah, not in detail though.
Yeah, so he bought 40 of the organ meat supplements on the market, and this paper is yet to be published, but will be soon. And he found some pretty wild things, like some of them very nutrient dense. Others wasn't even certain there was actually organ meats in there. So we're gonna do a whole podcast in there. He might do a follow-up where he actually tries to identify what is in those supplements, because it was kind of all across the board. And but we'll learn more about that in a second. But yeah, organ meats, something that make me feel measurably different too, as well as fish. So fish, fatty fish, sardines you've mentioned. Are there certain fish that really stood out in this category too that people could incorporate?
Yeah, small fish in general, because you can eat them whole. So if they're canned, whether that's mackerel or sardines or anchovies, those all scored really well. The fatty fish with the skin on it, so the salmon consumed with like a canned salmon with the skins and the bone, that scores well, or canned mackerel. They may, people may not like the taste of those, but tuna scores pretty well too, because especially the fattier cuts, it's pretty high in omega-3. Dried fish, which we don't really eat in the U.S. People don't have small dried fish much in the U.S., but that's a high scoring one, which is consumed in different parts of Africa and Asia. But yeah, in general, I mean, the other piece that people maybe aren't as familiar with is these bivalves, or clams, mussels, and oysters, which they're a bit expensive in the US, but they're very nutrient dense. And I think if people can I think they taste great. So if you're palatable to that, you can have those in your diet. And then shellfish, shellfish, the category of crustaceans where you have shrimp and crab, those score highly as well. So very nutrient dense.
I love that. Yeah, those are the three foods that I kind of try to get in every day in some way since I saw your research. So thanks for that. Now let's talk about the other end of the spectrum, the least nutrient dense foods. So can you tell us what was at the bottom of the totem pole?
Yeah, at the very bottom is the sugary beverages. So the sugar sweetened soft drinks. So think of Coca-Cola, Gatorade, things like that. So there's no real nutritional value in those, and they're just providing liquid calories, which, at least if there's one thing everyone can agree about, it's that soda and sugary beverages are not a very healthy food. So those are at the bottom. Then you have grain-based baked sweets. So these are thinking about like desserts that are baked, croissants, and donuts, anything, cookies, anything that's sort of baked. So it's high in refined starch, sugar, oil, combined together, very palatable, tasty. So instant noodles, which are things like ramen, if you think about packets of ramen, just tons of sodium and refined wheat flour, almost no nutrients in there, but a lot of starch, a lot of sodium. packaged ultra processed salty snacks. So those are things like potato chips or veggie straws, anything that sort of dissolves in your mouth that's in a package. So, other things, refined grains in general, did not score well, and other sweets and stuff. But those were at the very bottom of the list.
Yeah. And what about like brown rice, white rice, bread, things that are like not like sweets and not like cereal and not soda, but how are
Hmm.
they scoring?
Yeah, so right above sort of those packaged ultra processed salty snack foods, you have the refined grains. So that's where white rice will fall into, or white bread would fall into that, refined wheat pasta, for example. So they're towards the bottom. They're not the worst foods, but they're not carrying a lot of nutritional value, and they do have some risk for, blood pressure, blood sugar regulation, and chronic disease prevention or risks. So those are towards the bottom. Now the whole grains were up several points, and so whole grains are towards the middle range, but not at the highest because they're, again, sort of with crop breeding, we bred these to be sweeter, to taste better, to grow faster, to have higher yields, and what that did unintentionally was reduce the nutritional value of those foods. Now there are exceptions. There are traditional grains that have higher nutritional value. So certain millets, for example, are a bit higher in nutritional value than the typical corn, wheat, and rice varieties.
Okay. Do you know of any products like a millet-based like bread? Is there that on the market, or any products that you think are millet-based that might be better suitable alternatives for people out there?
So if you can tolerate gluten, the Ezekiel bread is really good. It has sort of sprouted grains and legumes, and it's a variety of those. The sprouting reduces the phytate, so it makes them more bioavailable. They're actually considered flourless, so they're not refined. They're not processed as much, because if even in whole grains, they get broken down so much that they absorb faster and they don't have the same structure. So the Ezekiel bread, at least in the US, is one that I think is a pretty solid bread if you can afford it and if you can tolerate the taste of it.
Okay. And then also cheese. I've been seeing research prevents Alzheimer's potentially. It's one of those whole food matrix saturated fatty acid rich foods that might actually reduce heart disease risk factors. So it was kind of moderate. Talk about cheese. Is it
Hmm.
something we should be focused on?
Yeah, you're right. So one of the fascinating things is in the studies that look at the sort of associations of products with health outcomes, cheese does pretty well within the dairy category. And, it's not every study and it's not every outcome. But in general, I think cheese, depending on your diet and your sort of preferences of your overall diet, I think people can have a moderate amount of cheese and be very, very healthy. It has a lot of, it has vitamin K2, it has a lot of calcium, right? There's a lot of benefits of cheese. It has beneficial bacteria as well. But in our system, one of the limitations was we weren't sort of able to include any measure of sort of bioactive compounds for gut health. And so that was one component we didn't get. And then it got penalized, which I think was a little bit unfair on the saturated fat, because saturated fat from dairy products that are in the whole form, so yogurt, milk, cheese, as you know, they're not really associated with the same negative health outcomes that saturated fat gets blamed for more generally. So I think the dairy fat itself is a relatively benign fat, especially when it's part of the whole food matrix. But yeah, they scored. There was a range. I think they were from high 30s to up to about almost 60. So the sort of the mid range, lower than I would maybe have liked them to be, but many of the cheeses, paneer scores I think 58 or something. So it's higher up there. So yeah, the cheeses are sort of the system is going to look at the sodium content. They're penalized for that. It looks at the energy density, the calories in it. They're penalized for that. And so it's kind of hard to get away from that unless you make exceptions for food groups. And we did our best to be as sort of objective as we could.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, because you were getting that pressure about saturated fat. And I mean, maybe like, I don't know, they probably wouldn't have been open to. How about we apply this only to the not whole food? I mean, you know what I mean? No food matrix.
Yeah.
But I know, like, you were getting as close as you possibly can. So two other food groups I want to talk about. Red meat. you scored, I think it was like a 58. And I know that people probably had some strong thoughts about that. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think the two ones that I got feedback, which was exactly opposite, was on red meat and soy milk and products.
Yes. Yes.
So they score pretty similar, right? And I think what people really like on both camps, the people who love like the carnivores and the low carb folks and the keto folks were saying red meat is the only food you can live off of. It should be the top score, right? Which sort of ignores the overall population and the overall sort of diet that works for a population, and the balance of foods. But so anyways, people didn't like that it scored not 100. But if you look at any of the other systems out there, red meat scores a bit lower. So our system is actually showing the nutrient density and nutritional value of red meat, I think, more than any other system out there. And then on the other side, when you look at red meat and from the sort of vegan plant-based groups, they're like, how can it score this high? Because there's all these chronic disease risk factors from it, right? And so we did not do a penalty for the food group of red meat. We penalized highly ultra processing. So ultra processed meat was definitely penalized, but we did not do that for red meat because, in our view, this is not a dietary guidance. It's not a full diet. It's talking about individual foods. And so within a healthy diet, we don't see a huge risk factor for moderate red meat consumption. Now, the folks who are sort of on the plant-based side said they liked that soy was scoring higher, but the carnivores and those groups were just saying, how can soy is trash. It's like, how can you possibly score that well? And to me, it's like, I eat both. Like what's interesting is I will have a protein bowl or something, a salad bowl or something at a restaurant, and I'll order one with tofu and red meat. And for some reason, anytime people are hearing both of those, they think like, how can you have tofu? How does he want the tofu version and the red and the beef at the same time? But I eat both of those. It's like most people will go towards one or the other.
Again, it's just like balance. Like, right? You are so balanced. I love that. Though I think, I used to drink a soy milk latte every morning, but it was highly sweetened. You know what I mean? It wasn't the kind of soy, and it didn't work for me. I think I might be allergic to soy, but like you said, for some populations, it can work. And the last one I'm wondering about is fruit. Are there certain fruits? How did it rate overall? And are there ones that you would have people gravitate towards if they're going to go that direction?
Yeah, I think the fruit category is a little bit tricky because I don't want to discourage fruit consumption because I don't think in the US, there's not much risk of people eating too much fruit. But I think just by the definition of the algorithm, they score lower than vegetables because they have more sugar in them, right? And they have, in general, lower nutrient density and less fiber. And so they're not the most nutrient dense foods. Now, I think if you have all your nutrient needs met, the more fruit, and you're not, particularly diabetic or very sensitive to sugar in foods, I think you don't need to worry about fruit consumption. But certainly there was a range. So watermelon, I mentioned, coconut is kind of classified as a fruit, and that sort of scores lower. It doesn't actually contain, it's not particularly nutrient dense versus some of the other fruits. And I think what's interesting to me is that you can look at traditional types of foods, and traditional foods can score quite a bit higher. I can't think of there's like a fruit called hog plum. I could look up, if you have time, I could pull up the list. There's a whole site that we're building with actually, you mentioned 289 foods, right? But what we've been doing since this was published, and actually before it was even published, is we've been compiling traditional foods from around the world. So we have almost 1,000 unique traditional foods. And
How cool.
If you go to fruit, African star apple scores 85, which is very high. African locust bean fruit scores 63. Waterberry scores 61. White crossberry scores 56. Tondolo scores 53. Elephant apple 52. Hog plum 52. And this is on a stricter system. So the thing about the NVS is that when you run the algorithm, it depends on the foods in the data set. When you expand it, we expanded it to a bunch of nutrient-dense traditional foods from other countries. And so what it did is it brought down the overall scores down quite a bit. So this just kind of shows there are a lot of options within these food groups that score really high,
Yeah.
even if the overall average of the foods is quite a bit lower. And that's what's really interesting about this work we're doing now is we're trying to identify traditional foods to prioritize. So I could give you another example, like in the roots and tubers,
Yeah.
some of the foods that score really high that you may not have heard of is purple taro,
Nice.
anchote, chufa, galangal root, tippy tambu, winged bean tuber, turnip. So there are roots and tubers that score high. In the whole grains, I mentioned certain types of millets, right? You have finger millet, proso millet, foxtail millet. You have fonio, teff. So it's interesting that even in categories that typically don't score as high, that's because we're looking at things from our modern sort of Western perspective of what's out there and available in general. And we eat, most of our calories come from like, 5 to 10 crops and animal products, right?
I know. Yeah, which is
We're
so
not eating
sad.
a lot of
So that hog apple, that's not what it was called. What was the one
hog
that was
plum.
85? Hog plum. Because that was scored higher than liver. Is that
Well,
right?
the highest one, African star apple, was the
Yes.
highest one.
Okay.
Yes, and it's 85 on this system. So if it was if we added it into the original, it would probably be like 90 or something, right? So it's quite up there. And we looked at we had insects. There's some high scoring insects out there.
Okay.
We looked at some of the wild. So some of these foods, they're sort of like wild foods. When we talk about the breeding process, wild foods have retained their nutritional value because they have not been domesticated and bred out all the nutrition in the process. And so that's why we still have, and it's an important sort of research agenda, is to maintain all of this species diversity that we have around the world and to really like document it, promote it, be able to produce it where you can, sell it, produce new foods, products with it, right? That's the goal.
It's so cool too, because like we've been breeding these and raising these. We prioritize, starchy yield, and then all those micronutrients go by the wayside. But if you create this catalog like you're doing of these more traditional wild, I think that's exactly what we need to kind of turn that back around and prioritize nutrient density rather than just can we grow something really big with a lot of calories.
Yeah. There's also, just on that point, there's this whole effort now, thankfully, where science and advocacy has caught up that we have been doing this breeding without really thinking of one of the key components, which is nutritional value. And so we've started to breed nutrition back into crops, and that's done through, it's called nutrient-enriched crops, it's called biofortification, but essentially we are being intentional about adding nutrient content. You can even control the amount of anti-nutrients in foods. So not only do you make them more resilient, drought tolerant, etc., pest resistant, but you can actually breed in more nutritional value, which I think is really, really great that we're starting to pay attention to.
Absolutely. And what does that process look like? Like, how do you biofortify? That's fascinating.
You basically take, okay, so I'm not a geneticist or a crop breeder or agricultural specialist, but you take the versions of the crops that you want, you take the traits that you want, and you breed them into, you create crops that can be produced in the focus region that you're talking about. So one example is sweet potato. We think of like orange flesh sweet potato as the most common sweet potato, but in Africa, it's actually more of like a white or a pale yellow sweet potato that's more common. But the orange flesh doesn't necessarily grow as is in all of those contexts. And so what they do is they breed the traits of the high beta carotene into the varieties that can be produced in that context. So this is also done. You can do high iron, high zinc beans. You can do that for corn. You can do that for wheat. And so you can really sort of superpower these things in the breeding process. And that gets, when we talk about fortifications where we add vitamins and minerals, that's a good safety net, but it doesn't change the food matrix. Those are added to oftentimes pretty processed foods. But what's cool about this biofortification is you can have the minimally processed whole food with the higher nutrient content in the food itself.
Awesome. That's really exciting. Now, do you think that there could be a processed fortified food that is actually worth consuming? Or do you think people should really focus only on whole foods? Or what is your stance on that?
I think with processing, processed foods are not bad or should not be avoided. It's more of the ultra processed or highly processed foods. So it depends on the degree. So a can of beans is processed. I do not think people should limit their bean intake unless you need to for your gut health or something, right? Frozen vegetables are processed, right? So that those are all fine. But yes, when we talk about the harmful types of processing, even if you think of the worst offenders, so a sugary beverage, a donut, a cookie, cake, candy, if they're a small part of your diet, if they're consumed in moderation or modest amounts, that is not necessarily a huge problem for a lot of people, right? They're a part of all sorts of cultural aspects, celebrations, pleasure, all of that. But the problem comes when the proportion in the diet starts to creep up. And I would say, in the US, we have about 60% of the calories come from ultra processed foods. For youth and adolescents, it's closer to 70%. So if we got that down to 25%, I think that's going to be a lot better for people's health overall. You can have some in moderation. You can have one or two ultra processed foods a day. I don't think it's a huge problem. It's really when it becomes the dominant diet that you're eating.
Yeah, awesome. And do you think, what would you do differently if now knowing what you know, based on the feedback you received, you said bioactive compounds, maybe how it affects the gut. I'm also kind of wondering, like you said, within groups, like the way beef is raised, grass-fed, different than feedlot. Like, what would you take into account if you could, if it were a perfect
Yeah.
system you could create?
Well, it's a timely question because we are looking into doing this in the US specifically. So keep in mind this was a global study, and so we were limited by the data available. And we used a lot of US data to supplement that because most countries don't have very detailed data of their nutrient content. So you're right, like the beef from one ranch versus another, even if it's within grass-fed, is not the same, especially if you go between, sort of a conventional versus a regenerative, they're not the same. The algorithm can detect that to some extent if you actually have the data, but the data is the challenge. It's hard to have all that data. Now there's a company called Audacious that we're hoping to partner with who does a lot of these sampling. You may have worked with them, but they work with these food companies to do a lot of sampling to get at the nuance of all these sophisticated data points on what types of nutrients and phytochemicals and stuff are in their foods. If I was to do this from sort of the ground up again, I would keep the overall structure and the weighting. I'd probably keep the same because it's a sort of a global application. I think we got it pretty close to right. But I would, try to add something for fermented foods that have live active cultures, right? I think that you could get away if you could come up with sort of way to sort of proxy for that. You can make some assumptions. It's not going to be perfect, but a minimally processed dairy yogurt, if it's a refrigerated pickled fruit, you can assume it's probably has live active cultures, not necessarily, but it's more likely to. So I think there are ways to do that. But what I would do differently and this is something we're actually proposing to do if we get the funding to do it, is do a US focused setup. So we can tailor the algorithm to the US. We could add a component for added sugar if we have the data for that.
Yeah.
We can expand it to all of the high volume products that people purchase at stores, at Costco, at Fry's, wherever you shop, right? And there's really we did the homework on this to understand we probably need to get around 200,000 products rated to be able to have it more accessible. And you don't need all of those exactly because there's some imputation, which is where you sort of take scores from related food groups and you fill in gaps and stuff. There are ways to get at that with not that many data points, but you would need a lot. So if we were to do that, I would probably just go through and develop, have an advisory board where you have people on different sides of the debate, you have respected scientists come together and try to make some of these decisions. What are we going to weight the saturated fat to unsaturated fat ratio? How much is that going to play a role in this score? Should we reduce? I would probably reduce the vitamin and mineral content a little bit, the weight of those, because in the US we do have deficiencies, but it's not the same as in low-income countries, and we did this as a global system. So I would adjust the weights of the algorithm as well, and hopefully add some things about additives, like do you have not just added sugar, but do you have additional additives like flavorings, artificial flavors that have some link to disease risk. And so if we have the data, it's really about how much data can you get. And to me, the system is strong enough as is that if we didn't add any other domains to it, and we were just to implement it in the US and tweak the weighting, we would have a really good system. Like I think we would have a way to distinguish the healthfulness of foods. So we could create a mobile app. We could have food package labeling where we're influencing that. So that's the goal.
I love that. And have you heard of the Core Blue Blanc Blue? Core. Anyway, it's a system in France where they essentially do that, like with the nutrient density of their animal products specifically. It's like not only are they advertising the practices, but also the nutrient density. And I think that's the future. That has to be the future. So
Yeah.
really cool system. And maybe like when you penalize a food like a yogurt for saturated fat, if that has to maintain its position in your algorithm, you could give a bonus for like live bacteria or something. I don't know. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I also think it's possible for the whole dairy products. I think if you got an advisory board to say, look, we're looking at the evidence and we all agree we should not have the saturated fat penalty applied to whole yogurt, cheese, and milk, you could do that. I think if you do that, it's going to be scrutinized. But I think if you do it with an advisory group, you make that process transparent and somewhat democratic, and then I think your bases are covered. So I would be very open to doing that in a version that's adapted to the US.
Very, very cool. Okay, so just to wrap it up, I want to get a little practical. So knowing all of this, how has that changed how you personally eat? And what do you think the largest levers people could pull, like if they wanted to make just a few simple changes based on this system?
Yeah, I think if you're the average American, starting with the worst offenders is probably the best bet. So if you can reduce your soda consumption, even fruit juice, that's one that it sort of has a health halo over it. I would not put fruit juice in a healthy category. Liquid sugar is not good. So if you can reduce they come up in other places, right? The Starbucks, if you have that very sweet Starbucks dessert type drink, a lot of sugar comes in there. So the coffee and tea products, the sodas, the Gatorade, and then the refined products. So I think sort of the guidelines with the new US guidelines, I really liked how it emphasized really cut down on ultra processed foods, pay attention to refined carbs, don't have as many of the refined carbohydrates, even the white rice and refined flours, refined pasta, white bread, and you just replace it with minimally processed whole foods. And when you're looking for the best sources of nutrients, go for the dark leafy greens as much as you can. Include a little organ meat, have fish and shellfish regularly, right? I think those are sort of staples. And then in the other categories that are sort of pretty nutrient dense but not at the very top, consume legumes, beans, lentils, eggs, minimally processed dairy products, just poultry meat or red meat as sort of in moderation as needed, and nuts and seeds. And I think we'd all be a lot healthier if we sort of went that way.
Yeah, and are there because we already talked about bread, Ezekiel, potentially, millet-based. What about cereals? Are there certain cereals, if someone's got to do it, that you think would be the best options?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what your preferences are. I think the plain Cheerios are not too bad. If you look at the added sugar and starch, it's only 1 or 2 grams per serving. And there's a bit of fiber in there. And they are kind of like little multivitamins. And so they do contribute to nutrient adequacy quite a bit. So if you're going to consume a cereal that's ultra processed, I think just plain Cheerios are not a bad option. They're pretty tasty. They're not too bad. They add quite a bit of nutrients. Now, if you're going to go for the Honey Nut Cheerios, there's 12 grams of added sugar. So don't let that marketing fool you. It's a very different product, the Honey Nut Cheerios, from the regular Cheerios.
And as that, I didn't even think about this question as we close, but there's no real conflicts of interest for you because when the Food Compass was created, right, there was, actual brand names mentioned and maybe some funding. But how do you have any funding that you feel the need to disclose?
Yeah. That is very unique about this system. It's the first system that I'm aware of that didn't have any industry funding. So we didn't take anything from a plant-based company or animal-based company whatsoever. It's free of conflicts of interest. It doesn't mean we don't have our own biases, but like you sort of mentioned, we do our best to stay balanced and take perspectives from all sides. So this was developed without any industry involvement. The other thing is that industry influences the ratings. I mentioned Nutri-Score and Health Star rating. Industry is very much involved with how those systems were developed and how they're maintained. And so you're never going to get an objective system if you don't stop the conflicts of interest.
Perfect. And you're making headway on that. I love that. So as we close, let us know, is there any way that this has changed the way you eat? And then where can we connect with you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, I mean, I eat a very nutrient dense diet already, so my diet hasn't changed very much. But I think what I'm sort of fascinated about is looking at the varieties within food groups that score really well. So I have started eating sometimes some of these varieties that score better than other things, and I'll eat more, seeds, for example, because some of those seeds score well. I'll look at some of the legume varieties. I haven't tried these traditional fruit, but I'm interested in trying these traditional fruit if I can, right? I try to eat in general, I try to eat a nutrient-dense diet because it meets my nutrient needs, helps me feel good and energized, and it helps me feel full. So I'm not as likely to eat too much.
Perfect. And yeah, tell us, what did we miss, if anything? And then where can we connect with you if we want to follow your work? Actually, I want to tell them I love your podcast. Your podcast, you do deep dives on, ultra processed foods and so many different health related topics. It's one of the podcasts that I listen to very regularly. So check them out there. But are there other places you'd like to direct people?
Yeah, just if you find me on socials, it's Ty Beal PhD. So you can find me there. You can go to tybeal.com and follow my research. You can look up on Google Scholar anything that's published and talk to me. You can send an email or send a message to me on socials.
I'm so excited about your American algorithm. I think that's going to be really fun, and about this plant varieties and about biofortification. So thank you, as always. Such a pleasure to talk to you, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Adam.